So I have a few slides that I want to go through. Caroline gave me some questions as well, which I think people sent in advance. So I'll try and spend more time on answering those questions rather than hitting the main points of my slide because I'm conscious of time. But in oh, that didn't sound good. Maybe that was just one person leaving because it looks like I'm still going. So yeah, so as I said, I'll try and answer as many questions as I can. I think we got a lot of questions in advance. I think hopefully we'll have a bit of time for questions at the end as well if we can. I understand and I'm conscious, having done this before, a lot of people might have very personally specific situations, which happens all the time, which I might not be able to get into in total detail there, but I'll try and make it as useful for everyone in answering your specific questions. And I'm going to try and hang around afterwards, loitering around the outside, helping you with any particular questions that might have, if that is helpful. So that's me 7 years ago. I don't look like that anymore. I'm sorry, but that's life. So just to talk a little bit about agenda, I'm just going to give you a quick intro to Irish immigration. I'm sure you all know about it already, but I just want to give you some of the key terms so that you know what you're talking about when it comes time to talking about that with potential employers. I'm going to give you just a little bit of overview around what the graduate and student permissions are. I want to talk to you a bit about employment permits and Stamp 4. Most people in this room are possibly on a Stamp 2 or moving on to a Stamp 1G, which are the student and graduate permissions. Employment permits is the next logical step in the pathway to long-term residency in Ireland. So I do want to give you some key pieces of information about those employment permits so that you know what you're looking out for when you're job hunting and when you're getting offered loads of jobs from all the different great companies in Ireland. And then I've got loads of slides of questions at the end. Grant. So with that, I do want to start talking about just key immigration terms for Ireland, okay? So a lot of people, when they're talking about immigration in Ireland, including people from Ireland, they talk about the visa process, okay? The visa is only one element of what can be a three-stage process of immigration for people coming to Ireland, and it doesn't even apply to everyone, okay? The three pieces I want to talk to you about are employment permit, entry visa, and then the IRP card or residence card, okay? An employment permit effectively is your permission to work. That's what we in Fragomen do the most of by far. We work with clients across all industries in Ireland and abroad, talking about employment permits and getting their employees employment permits so that they have a permission to work, okay? So when we're talking about permission to work, we don't necessarily talk about visas. We are talking about employment permits. The visa then is an entry visa, and that's really specifically just to get people on the plane coming to Ireland from certain countries, okay? Most countries in the world for Ireland are visa required. There are certain areas and parts of the world that don't require a visa. So those individuals might be looking at this and saying, what's a visa? I've never even heard about this. And that will be because it's not necessarily eligible for every single person, okay? The entry visa, as I said, is just to get people on the plane over to Ireland so that they can travel and get in through the border. It doesn't really serve much else of a purpose. Individuals who are applying for a visa need to apply. There's a reason why you're applying for a visa, okay? For the individuals that we work with, it tends to be because they have an employment permit, they've got their job. I'm now going to apply for my visa so I can literally come to Ireland and do my job. But if you're coming over on holidays, or you're coming on a business trip, or you're coming to study, that would be the reason as why you're applying for a visa if you're from certain visa required countries, okay? Once you get here, you get your IRP card, and hopefully everybody in this room has either got one or is going to get one soon. And that's your residence card, okay? And that's your permission to reside in the country. So you've got your permit, which is your permission to work, your visa, which is your permission to enter, and your IRP card, which is your permission to live in Ireland, okay? When we talk about IRP cards, you've probably all seen it. They're like kind of like a credit card size. You get it through registering in Berkey in Dublin if you've come here for the first time, and you renew it online if you're living in Dublin and the surrounding counties, as well as Cork and Limerick. People talk about then the stamps and what stamp are you on? Stamps are on your card, okay? So everyone's IRP card has an associated stamp with it, okay? And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail soon. But people talk about stamps or cards. They're one of the same in essence, right? The card is showing your face and saying why you're here, and the stamp is the corresponding permission on it. So that's kind of a key term that you'll hear a lot about. So those are the three main pieces of the immigration process that you're going to need. Give it a little bit more background about the key government agencies. I picked the two most important ones because they're the two that you're probably most going to engage with. The Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment are the ones that we do a lot of work with for employment permits, okay? They are entirely dealing with employment permits. They set the sort of, they're deal with mostly just the sponsored employees, as we say. So when you've got an employer and they want to hire you, long-term to work for their company, they are going to go to make an application through Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, where they will be issued the employment permit, as we spoke about before. That's kind of really the main thing that they deal with from an immigration perspective. They decide on like the eligibility, on like the critical skills list, which people have been talking about and heard about. They decide on what are the criteria in relation to getting employment permits and what salaries and stuff that you need. But ultimately, that's kind of the main thing that they're going to deal with. And they are business focused for the most part, which is great. We love them because they want to make things as easy as possible for people to come to Ireland and work. We love them. Department of Justice, maybe slightly different in their focus. Immigration service delivery are the element of the Department of Justice that actually manage immigration for the Department of Justice. And they kind of deal with general immigration and enforcement, okay? So they deal with all non-EA nationals as well. So everyone here has probably dealt with the Department of Justice because they're doing the IRP cards, okay? That's one of their main elements for what the type of work that they do. So they issue and sometimes refuse IRP cards. They also deal through embassies in the Department of Foreign Affairs. They deal with the entry visa process as well, and they set policies relating to that. And they do all sorts of other permissions, like there's an AWS working permission that they do. They look after international protection. They look after investor programs as well. They do citizenship, and ultimately they do the registration piece in Dublin as well. So to understand Irish immigration, and sometimes you're like, why is this so annoying? Why is this not working properly? It's because sometimes you've got two government departments who try to work together, but maybe are coming at it from the different perspectives. Department of Enterprise, as I said, is very business focused and tends to be quite progressive in how they do things. Department of Justice, a little bit more old school, perhaps coming at it from a different perspective. They've got a wider remit where immigration is just part of it. And so sometimes they work well together. Sometimes there's sort of competing interests there. And that kind of maybe explains a little bit about why Irish immigration the way it can be sometimes. Not uncommon across the world to have a couple of different government departments involved. I used to work in Canada and live in Canada, and that was all done in one, and that was great. Everything kind of worked that little bit more smoothly. But in saying that, I do find Ireland's immigration process reasonably competitive compared to the rest of the world, especially in the employment permit sphere, maybe less so for the Department of Justice. So then just talking a little bit about the overview of graduate permissions, I just put in the two main ones that you're probably most likely to see then that you currently have, right? And it's the Stamp 2 and the Stamp 1G. So if we're going back and remember what we were talking about stamps, those are the residence cards. Every residence card has a stamp associated with it, okay? The Stamp 2 is a permission to study full-time in one of the, what's called the ILEP or the eligible course programs and courses. And you can also work in casual employment during that time. A question that comes up a lot when people actually read it is like, Colin, what does casual employment mean? They don't really say what casual employment is. We would have a lot of our clients who would hire people sort of on the sort of 20 hours or 40 hours per week through what would be considered less casual employment, like normal employment. They haven't defined what it is, so we're not going to ask too many questions. We're happy that the government are allowing people to work on the Stamp 2, okay? Ultimately, you're allowed study in Ireland for up to 7 years, okay? So that's something to bear in mind when we're talking about the overall pathway to a 1G, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But 7 years is kind of the amount of time, broadly speaking, that the government allows individuals to study in Ireland. Working is obviously a key part of being in Ireland, especially considering how expensive it is. Individuals are eligible to work on a Stamp 2 in 20 hours per week inside of term time and 40 hours per week outside of term time. Term time is typically described as from January to September inclusive, and then December 15th to January 15th as well. So there's windows of opportunities where you're allowed to work up to 40 hours per week, but it is fundamentally a student permission. And the idea is you're here to study and the work is supplementary to that. So that's kind of the overarching principle to bear in mind, okay? So you've done your Stamp 2, you're studying here, you're doing an undergraduate or a master's, great. You're looking at the next step in the process, you're on your Stamp 1G, okay? And the Stamp 1G, I'm trying to read what I actually have written here, is permission to be to look for employment under the third level graduate program, okay? So that is why it's there. It's ultimately to help a pathway from you guys who are here as students studying on a Stamp 2, moving towards graduate employment, appropriate graduate employment. And then from there, then ultimately, hopefully you'll go on to get an employment permit or another pathway to immigration, okay? Stamp 1Gs are for 12 months for undergraduates. And even if you're doing a master's, people will understand and think, and correctly think, I did a master's that's eligible for 2 years of the Stamp 1G, which is true. But immigration will only ever give you 12 months at a time, okay? So you might go in expecting your 24-month on a Stamp 1G. broadly speaking, that won't happen. You'll get an initial 12 months, at which point then you can decide, do I want to get another 12 months if I've done my master's, or am I going to want to just move on to an employment permit sooner? Okay. One of the restrictions on the Stamp 1G is that you can't actually operate a business or be self-employed on a Stamp 1G. That changes once you get to Stamp 4, but there's just some restrictions in place. The whole idea around the Stamp 1G is the pathway towards sort of a longer term immigration process, which would be ultimately an employment permit and potentially a Stamp 4, which I'll talk about in a minute. But operating a business is not really one of the restrictions on the actual immigration card. You might see other individuals on a Stamp 1G that aren't graduates. Those individuals are spouses, dependent spouses of employment permit holders. They also get a Stamp 1G, so it's kind of confusing, but that's what it means for you guys. So how do you become eligible for a Stamp 1G and what's the process? As I said, it's designed for a pathway to seek for graduates to seek graduate level employment. It's the pathway to an employment permit as well. So that's kind of what the idea around it is. In order to get a Stamp 1G, you have to hold a valid Stamp 2, and that needs to be something that you need to bear in mind. So we really don't want to have a situation where people's Stamp 2 is expiring or expired and you want to move into a Stamp 1G. There's kind of there's a gray area window where you can operate, but ultimately you want to be making sure that you're planning the next steps as soon as you can. In order to apply for it, you have to be notified in writing of successful achievement of your award or degree. I know that comes up especially this time of year because you might be waiting on results or maybe had repeats or something like that, and your permission might be due to expire. There's a mechanism in which you can potentially extend while you're waiting for results, but ultimately they're not really likely to issue your Stamp 1G until you've got your results and confirmed that you've been awarded your degree or your master's. Okay. You do that by applying online. It used to be all down at Berkey. Every year you'd have to go down, you get an appointment, and anyone who's here a few years would know how terrible this process that was. If you're really old like me, you'll remember people literally queuing outside the door around the corner at like 3 a.m. So it has improved. But it's an online process now for anyone living in Dublin and the surrounding counties. But the blessing and the curse of the online is that it's slightly less personal approach. So sometimes you might have a situation that is unusual and you get to chat with the immigration officer there and just explain your case, and they would say yes or no under those circumstances. Now it's done online. In theory, it works quite well and we don't see massive pushback, but occasionally, like I was only talking to someone there who got their Stamp 2 refused for no reasons, and when they sent the email, they didn't even put a reason on the email. They sent the template and forgot to include the reason, and we have no idea why. So those are the kind of things that can happen, which is less likely to happen if you're going to meet someone in person, but those are rare occasions. In theory, the online process does work quite well. Right. So just a couple of things I wanted to make people aware of as well while we're here. One of the things that we see often is when students are applying for an employment permit or coming out of a graduate program into an employment permit, they haven't left themselves enough time to get the employment permit. Okay. And again, this time of year, typically from September to December, that's when we see most of the Stamp 2s and Stamp 1Gs expires, just based on the natural life cycle of the immigration process for students and graduates. So where possible, give yourself as much time as you can to move on to an employment permit. So the first question actually that's on my my slides at the end is a really good one about when should I move to Stamp 1G, so we can talk about that a little bit more when we get closer to the time. Registration offices can be reluctant to extend permissions, but of late they've gotten a little bit better because they understand, you know, universities and colleges might not be quite as quick as getting results out, and that might affect individuals' eligibility to stay and remain in the state while they're waiting for the results. So they've given a little bit more grace there, but they're never going to say it's grand, don't worry about it on the website, because they just don't like to do that. But once they deal with it on a case-by-case basis, and things, they tend to be reasonable. But what you do want to try and do is just try and get out in front of any of the issues that you're going to have by preparing and looking to get your employment permit, if that's what you're moving to, or your Stamp 1G, in as much time as you can, just to avoid any difficulties. Okay. It's important to know the permission and the restrictions of your permissions. I wouldn't ever assume that your employer knows much about what a Stamp 2 or a Stamp 1G is, which is, again, a blessing and a curse. But for your own sake, I would be very mindful of what you can and can't do on the permissions that you have, okay? Because you don't want that to have a knock-on effect for your future immigration practices, okay? So they're all high-level principles, but if you're on a Stamp 2, I would definitely try and avoid working more than the 20 hours outside of the windows that you have. If you're on a Stamp 1G, I would definitely try and avoid operating your own business or operating as a sole trader or anything like that, just in case it causes any issues for your future immigration eligibility. And then travel restrictions. We're coming up to Christmas now. This happens every year, and actually the Department of Justice just released a note there during the week just to let people know that they need to apply for their renewals before October 31st in order to make sure that you're going to have your IRP card ready for travel at Christmas. Okay, so give yourself as much time as you can to make sure that you've got your cards ready to go, so that when you do travel and you return, you're going to have no issues getting on the plane and getting through the border. Okay, it happens a lot this time of year with travel, and what I always recommend people is if your immigration status happens to be expiring around the time you expect to travel, change your travel time or get your card sorted as soon as you can, because you just don't want any issues where you're waiting on a flight and you don't have your IRP card, and you don't want to have lost thousands of euro on a flight that you're hoping to take. Try and just be mindful and be aware at all times when you're due to expire and what you need to do in the meantime to make sure that you're not going to have major travel impact. Now, the good stuff, employment permits. I wanted to talk to you about the two main ones that you're likely to see, okay? General employment permit and critical skills, right? General employment permit is the old school original employment permit before there was the critical skills. There's a couple of key criteria that I think, I see your phones out, which is great. These are the key points that you want to remember, especially when you're looking for jobs. These are the criteria broadly what employers are going to be looking at when you're eligible for an employment permit, okay? For the most important ones are salary, obviously, and I want to talk a little bit about that because at the moment the minimum salary threshold for almost all employment permits is 34,000 euro. Okay, so if you're looking for an employment permit and your salary is below 34,000 euro, you're not going to be eligible for an employment permit no matter what the job is. Okay, now I put 39,000 there because as of January 1st, 2025, at the moment, the plan is for that to go up to 39,000, which is obviously a huge jump. Okay. So it's just something to be mindful of when you're looking at roles, that if you're applying for an employment permit, if anyone in this room has a job that's going to be starting soon and the role is over 34,000 but below 39,000, this is the time to get your permit because the salary threshold is going to go up in January. All right. It's obviously taken a very, very big jump over the last couple of years. Last year it was 30,000. It's gone to 34 this year. It's going to 39 next year. So those are huge increases. Obviously, if you can get a job that pays that from the get-go, brilliant. Go for it. That's a really good sign. And they're happy to sponsor you, even better. That's a really good sign. But just be mindful, if you're looking at your pathway to immigration, you need to be mindful of these are the restrictions that I might have when I'm looking for a job, knowing that I'm going to need a job that reaches this salary threshold so that I can ultimately get an employment permit and stay in Ireland. Okay. So I'm going to take questions at the end if that's okay. I think we'll have a roving mic. Well, I'll come back to you. Thanks. With regards minimum educational requirement, there is none specifically for the role, which is great, but for immigration purposes. But if the role requires a degree, just to be mindful that that is something that you may need. Occupations list. This comes down to roles that are eligible for an employment permit. Any role that's on the ineligible occupation list, which is listed on the Department of Enterprise's website, is not eligible for an employment permit, no matter how much they get paid or no matter how long it's for. Those roles aren't eligible. Though that list is decreasing massively because of the need for people in roles in Ireland. So that list is decreasing, but it's still there. So when you're applying for a job, it's no harm being mindful of that role and seeing to make sure that it's actually going to be ultimately eligible for an employment permit. Okay, everything that's not on that list is eligible for an employment permit. It's a bit tricky. Some employers will be used to it. If they're not, the likes of Fragomen and others will be out there to help you understand whether that role will ultimately be eligible for an employment permit. But it is on the employment permits section of the Department of Enterprise website. So I would definitely encourage people to look that up if they can. There might be a labour market needs test. What is that? Ultimately, your prospective employer, will need to advertise the role for up to 28 days potentially to try and find someone in the EU that can be capable of doing the job. If they don't find anyone, then they come and look at applying for an employment permit, which is the exception to allow them to hire someone from outside the EEA. So that's something that your employer might have to do in advance. Not all roles are eligible for it and need it if the salary is over a certain amount, 64,000 euro, or if the role is on the critical skills list, but for whatever reason doesn't qualify for critical skills, you can get around that need to advertise for the job. Hopefully that stage will already have been met by the time you guys engage with an employer on that process. This contract needs to be at least 3 months, which would be normal enough. A big change is and a difference between is and other permits is your dependent family. If anyone has family at home that aren't already here, they'll ultimately your spouse will ultimately be able to come and work in Ireland, but after 12 months on your role. So they're going to have to wait another additional 1 year with you working on a general employment permit before they can come over. But if they're already here and you get a general employment permit, they can work right away. So there's that's a relatively new thing and it's a good thing. The immigration pathways to long-term residency, stamp 4 after 5 years. I'll talk about stamp 4 in a minute. And then ultimately you can move on to citizenship from there. And what on your IRP card, you will move from a stamp 1G or stamp 2 to a stamp 1. All stamp 1s, most stamp 1s are associated with an employment permit. And that's when you get your employment permit, you're going to get an IRP card that's going to say stamp 1 on that. Critical skills, then, the one that everyone wants. And to be fair, a lot of employers are happy to sponsor, in my experience as well, where possible. At the moment, the salary threshold is 38,000 euro. That's going to go up to 44,000 euro in January 1st, 2025. So that's a really big jump again. So just to be mindful of that. One of the reasons why you might not get a critical skills employment permit, even if the role is considered critical skills, is if you don't have a relevant third level degree. Relevant is kind of vague. I use the example of I studied English. And if I went for an engineering job, I wouldn't get a critical skills because that English to me wouldn't be irrelevant to an engineering type role. But if you did an engineering degree, that would be considered relevant and you would get a critical skills. Okay. Those the only way you get around the relevancy piece is if you get a job that's pays over 64,000 euro. And 64,000 euro is a good sort of threshold to bear in mind. That kind of gets you past a lot of the requirements for eligibility for critical skills. If someone is lucky enough to get a job out of college that pays that much, then you're almost definitely going to be able to get a critical skills as long as it's not on the ineligible list. The occupations list, then, there's a critical skills list. If your salary is going to be between 38,000 and 64,000, your job needs to be on the critical skills lists. That's also on the Department of Enterprise website. It's a lot shorter, although growing. Roles in a lot of roles in finance, accounting, engineering, data analysis, IT roles tend to be on that list. Okay, so once they're on that list and you have a relevant degree and the salary is over 38,000 euro, you should be eligible for critical skills. The only other thing to be mindful of is the contract offer has to be at least 2 years, and the department are really weird about that, and that they're very cautious to make sure that it says either permanent or the contract actually shows at least 2 years of employment. So that's one thing to be mindful of. Your spouses, if they're at home, they can travel right away and they can work right away. So that's great. You get your stamp 4 after 2 years on a critical skill. So that's the real draw. And that's a really big benefit to you guys. If you do get a critical skills, you can move to that stamp 4 status right away. And again, employment permit means stamp 1 on the IRP card. You can't always tell on the IRP card. Stamp 1, it'll say stamp 1, but it won't say what type of permit you have, just in case you're wondering. We do have time, not too bad. Stamp 4 is then, what is a stamp 4? Basically, it's employment without the need for an employment permit. That's the easiest way to describe it. That's the thing that most people want to get to because ultimately it's closest to our version of permanent residence. Under that model of getting your stamp 4, you are eligible and flexible in your employment. You're not tied to your employer. You can, in this instance, operate and establish a business, which is great. Your dependent family members also have the same rights as they would have if they had a critical skill. So they can come, if they're not already here, they can come over and work and study, no problem. And it's the next step on the pathway to citizenship as well. So there's other benefits to it. Like I think you can apply for a mortgage and stuff like that on a stamp 4. So there's lots of benefits to getting there. And that's ultimately the next step after employment permits that people want to get to. Stamp 4 is a great permission from that perspective. Grant, I'm going to move on to the questions now. We're halfway through, so that's not too bad. And we will get back to any further questions afterwards. I've got a good few here. You can see it on screen. Great. So the first one, and I really like this question, and it's one that comes up quite a lot. Should I wait to get a stamp 1G until I get a job offer? It's great, and I'm going to say a really annoying answer. Depends. It depends on your situation, okay? I am always conscious that the problem with moving straight to should you get a stamp 1G until I get a job offer? I would say generally yes, but some employers like to move people straight to an employment permit, okay? So if you've done a master's and you're eligible for 2 years of a stamp 1G and you're on your stamp 2 and you're waiting to get your stamp 1G and your employer says, great, we want to hire you, but we want to sponsor you on a critical skills. Look, that's a good situation and I wouldn't necessarily turn that down, but what you're giving up when you do that is your freedom to move around, okay? So it's a bit of a risk. On the plus side, you've got your job, you've got your employment permit, and if you feel like this is where you want to be and what you want to do, super, you're doing that. But you're kind of tied into that role for at least 9 months anyway on the employment permit, because you've got an employment permit that's tied to that employer and you've got your stamp 1. You can't go back to a stamp 1G after you go for your stamp 1 employment permit. So that's where you have to decide, okay, am I going to commit to this company now, or do I want to stay in a stamp 1G, see if I like it? If I don't like it, maybe I'll get a job offer somewhere else and I can, you have more flexibility on that way. The other thing that could happen and does happen is that it could get more difficult to get an employment permit. It could get easier, and it has got easier down the years, but it could get more difficult. So it's kind of depends on your own situation. I know just from the clients that we work with, some of them will keep people on a stamp 1G for as long as possible, and they won't sponsor someone until they absolutely have to. I know other clients that want people on an employment permit right away, because ultimately it sort of has them tied in for that role for at least 9 months. Okay, so it's really up to yourself and your employer as to what you think is best for you. If it was me, and because I'm maybe a bit conservative and old now, I would probably like the idea of getting an employment permit because there's certainty. But I could totally see why someone might want to wait and say, see what's out there, and maybe it depends on the amount of offers you get and what the opportunities are. As I said, employment permits have moved to a place of being more flexible over the last few years. I don't know how long that's going to last, so it's good at the moment. But what you would hate to see happen is you being eligible for an employment permit now, and then it change in such a way that then you can't get an employment permit. So it is something to be mindful of. Are there any challenges one encounters with a stamp 1G? I mean, generally not. I mean, I always, because of the nature of my work, I always hear the bad things, but because that's when they need me. But oftentimes I find the process relatively straightforward. The main issues that I do see are waiting for results to come out, okay, and making sure that lines up with your current permission and stamp 2. Again, all I can recommend in that instance is just to be as focused as you can on when your end date is and try and put in place whatever you can to sort of elongate your status. There's opportunities to do that through the Department of Justice if there's delays in getting results. But largely, touch wood, hopefully most people here won't have many issues in moving into the stamp 1G. As I said, it's done online. Once you pass your exams, everything should move relatively smoothly. And 99% of the time, I would say it goes okay. And maybe I just hear the worst of it because, as I said, you won't need me unless there's a problem. And that's generally how I see the world with regards to immigration sometimes. But I do hear it's largely quite positive. But happy for anyone to tell me afterwards that, Colin, you're wrong, and stop telling everyone it's okay. Do you need to be present in Ireland to move from a stamp 2 to a stamp 1G? Yes. If you're doing that online, at the beginning of the application and at the end of the application, it's going to say, are you in Ireland? Tick this box if you're in Ireland and you're doing this application. So you should be in Ireland when you're doing that, okay? And that's all I'm going to say on that front. But they're asking you and declaring, and I'd be very, very wary of saying, yes, I'm in Ireland when I'm not in Ireland doing that application, okay? Because it's a small thing, but it's a very important thing. The way it used to be done up until relatively recently is you had to be physically present to get your card. So that is kind of carrying over in this process as well, okay? If you live outside of the 6 counties that currently do online applications, you do have to be in Ireland because you physically have to go to your local Garda station. Like I live in Kilkenny at the moment, so if I was in Kilkenny, I'd have to go to the Kilkenny registration office and get my card. So I obviously can't be, if I'm abroad, I won't be able to do that. So that principle carries over to online. So very much recommend and ensure that you should be in Ireland because you're asked at the beginning, at the end to confirm that you're doing it. And I wouldn't ever rely on an immigration application. It's not worth it. Can I get more stamp 1G permissions if I do masters and HDIPs? It's a really good question. You are allowed benefit from the stamp 1G process twice, okay? So you can't do it anymore. You can't continually perpetually do masters and then get an additional 1 or 2 stamp 1Gs, okay? You get 2 years on a masters, 1 year on an undergraduate, and you can dip in and out of that twice. So if you go and work, get an employment permit and you decide to go back to do a master's, and then you can get 1 extra one after that, potentially down to that. That's how the policy currently reads at the moment. That could obviously change, but I think the most traditional path is moving from undergrad to master's, or indeed coming straight in, doing your master's and being eligible for 2 years. But you can't perpetually go back and get more stamp 1Gs. 2 years total, exactly. Yeah. Can I self-sponsor a critical skills, and how does it work? Yes, you can self-sponsor. It's a weird process. Sorry, it's not weird. It's an unusual process globally, because when someone says, can I sponsor myself, you can do the application yourself, file the application yourself, but your employer can't be hands off on this, because ultimately the employer is signing and agreeing to the employment permit application as if they were doing the employment permit application. So an employer it's kind of it's framed strangely, and I just be mindful of an employer who says, oh, they're doing that themselves. The employer has to sign off and confirm everything that's happening and going in on the application. Okay, so you could do the application yourself, and indeed we have a private client team who would help individuals do an individual application, but we are making sure that the employer knows that they can't be absolved of responsibility for what happens, and that's what they need to be mindful of. Obviously, you as the employee needs to be following the rules on the application, but so does your employer. So whilst you can take the lead on the application and you can literally pay the fees and submit the application, your employer does need to sign stuff. They need to give you information, corporate information, so that the Department of Enterprise can assess it. So you can do it yourself, which is kind of unique in a lot of immigration processes for business around the world. But your employer does have to engage with it. They can't sort of say, oh, I don't have anything to do with this. That's not how it works. They're going to have to give you information and sign a form to allow for that. What happens if I get let go on a CSEP, or critical skills? Sorry, I say CSEP, which I mean critical skills employment permit. So it depends on the nature of how you're let go, I suppose. If you're made redundant, there's a whole redundancy process that you can go through, which will ultimately make you eligible for a reactivation employment permit, or just give you more time to actually stay in the country and find a new job. But that's going through the very specific process of redundancies, okay? If for whatever reason the company shuts down or you don't pass your probation period, that's a little bit more grey, but ultimately there's mechanisms that you can go through to ultimately reinstate your permission and get an employment permit. I was talking to someone just yesterday down in Carlow, actually, who wanted to hire someone who was part of a company, and ultimately the company dissolved, but they were slow in getting this individual sort of released from their employment permit, for want of a better phrase, and they've subsequently, their permission has expired. So what we're going to do there is write to the Department of Justice and explain the situation, ask that they give a temporary permission so that they can ultimately be hired on for this new company, which is who want to hire them. So there is some mercy there, and there are some mechanisms there depending on how the process is done. But it just kind of depends on the situation. But once you're here and you have a stamp 1 that's valid, that's a significant hurdle to overcome, and you can potentially move on to another employment permit from there. But there's a whole process in place for those who are specifically made redundant that's much more feasible and easier, and it makes it your second employment permit a lot easier to get, because you can get around some of the waivers that are in place. Can I get sponsorship for critical skills while I'm in college, or do I have to complete my master's? Yeah, you can. You don't necessarily need to complete your master's if your employer is happy to sponsor you before your master's is completed, or before you've got your results. You can move straight from a stamp 2 to an employment permit. We do see that. It just depends on your employer and depends on yourself. It goes back to the first question about stamp 1G. Do you want to give up your stamp 1G freedom of 1 or 2 years early in the process? That's kind of up to yourself and your employer. But I do see it. Most people do wait to get their stamp 1G and wait for their degree to be completed. But I suppose it just depends on how badly your employer needs you, I suppose. If I get a permit without an employer, how long do I have to stay with them? Or with an employer, how long do I have to stay with them? Can I move around? So there's been a recent change to the legislation which makes it easier for individuals to move and transfer with an employment permit. You now only have to stay with your initial employer for 9 months on your first permit, and then you can go through a separate process which is cheaper because there's no government filing fee, that you can move jobs as long as the job is within either the same job if it's a general employment permit, or within the same area of jobs if it's a critical skills employment permit. So that's a recent development. It's brand new. We've submitted our first application. They haven't got back to us yet, which is really annoying. So it's taking longer than a regular application, but it's good because it does give you freedom to move now. Okay, so if you get a job as a data analyst with company A, and company B comes in and says, we want to hire you, here's 10 grand more, you're like, yeah, absolutely. I can go through this change of employer application process, which doesn't have a government filing fee, so it's already €1,000 cheaper potentially. And you can ultimately change that job and go through a shorter application process. Now, it's very, very new, so I'm reticent to recommend it at the moment. But when it's actually up and running properly, I think it'd be a really good thing for you guys to have. Ultimately, you just have to make sure your first employment permit you've gone at least 9 months into your first employment permit. And that means you're able to continue over if you're on a critical skills. That counts towards your 2 years of a stamp 4. If it's on a general employment permit, that counts towards your 5 years going towards a stamp 4. So it looks like a really good process. Still really, really new, but a positive step for employees who are on an employment permit. How does a stamp 1A work? this is almost like its own topic, so I won't go into the specific details, but Stamp 1As are specifically for trainee accountants, individuals who are moving on to a training contract and who are getting supported by an employer who's going to do the sort of in-person work part of it, as well as the ACCAs or ACA or Chartered Accountants of Ireland who do the actual training and exams part. They ultimately govern that process, and it's a very specific process that allows you to study and do the required work in order to become an accountant. And that will ultimately work. Oftentimes it takes 2 or 3 years to become a qualified accountant, depending on the degree or master's that you have. But the Stamp 1A will be your pathway through that. It is difficult to move from an employer when you're on an initial Stamp 1A, so I would say be very mindful of that process. It's quite vague and unclear. It's kind of niche. I know a bit about it because I used to work in one of the big four and did it quite a bit. So it is kind of a weird area that has its own processes and its own policy. So just be mindful of who you ultimately do select, but you're going through that process of doing the exams and doing the training and everything along those lines. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to try and speed up a little bit as well if I can. Can I go from a permit back to a graduate Stamp 1G if I don't like my work? No, is the short answer, unfortunately. So that's why you have to be careful about moving away from your Stamp 1G. What's the situation with asylum seekers and work permits? Ultimately, asylum seekers have a pathway to work now, which is great. And I've seen it more and more over the past couple of years. Individuals who are granted asylum ultimately do get a Stamp 4, so you don't need to get an employment permit. If they're not going to get asylum, there is mechanisms to get an employment permit, but it's long and it's tricky, and it's not easy for employers to engage with that process, but it can be done. But ultimately, if you have a successful asylum application, you'll get a Stamp 4 and you should be able to work without need for an employment permit. What are the main issues for employers face when hiring non-EA nationals? The big one I find is just their lack of knowledge on the immigration process, which is why I like doing things like this, because I think you guys going in with a little bit of information about your own immigration status, you can help sell that to your prospective employees or employers. Tell them about your immigration and tell them what you need and tell them that it can be done, because for the most part it can be done. Ireland has a good immigration system that you've got over the hardest part, which is you're literally here in the country, and you can meet them face to face and you can show them your worth, which is brilliant. And you've got on the plane and you've got your visa, you're here. So that's half the battle easily. The next stage is just going through the immigration pathways, and hopefully something like this will help you just be a bit more confident about understanding what the process is, because there are mechanisms in place for employers here. And I find the biggest challenge, because I had it myself when I lived in Canada, is just telling them it's going to be okay. There's a process. I can either engage, or me and you can engage a company that can help us. And that's the kind of thing that I think is really useful. Is there a percentage cap on the number of non-EA nationals that employers can employ? Not officially, but in order to get an employment permit, an employer has to have at least 50% of their workforce as EEA nationals. So that's the EU, UK, Switzerland. So there is a cap to the amount of employment permits an employer can get. It doesn't come up all that often, but it probably is pertinent to startups that don't have that many people. But if you have a Stamp 4, you're not subject to that. It's just for employment permit applications. Same with if you have a Stamp 1G, you're not subject to those ratios at all. So that's a good thing there, because it's not an employment permit that you need to work for. What services do Fragomen offer? Loads. Anything immigration, you can come to us. I won't spend any time spending time selling that. On a Stamp 1G, can I work both full-time, 40 hours at my profession, and also at night part-time? Will it be a problem when applying for Stamp 4 or citizenship? Well done to whoever asked this question, because I didn't know the answer to this, so I went diving into the policy. And as long as you're meeting the labour laws, the employment laws, then you are fine to work more than 40 hours on a Stamp 1G. So that is fine. I didn't know that myself, actually. I didn't think that was allowed, but it seems to be allowed as long as you're not breaking any legislation. That's not immigration. Is there a negative in changing job during my first year Stamp 1G when it comes to renewing my card for a second year? There shouldn't be, I'm going to say, and rarely have I heard it be a problem. You've got the freedom to move on a Stamp 1G, and I haven't heard it be an issue unless some individual immigration officer takes issue with it, which they shouldn't. There should be flexibility allowed for that, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. Do you have to complete 2 years on your Stamp 1G before you can move to a critical skills employment permit? No, you can get a critical skills employment permit as soon as you're eligible, and you don't have to do anything towards the 2 years. And it goes back to the first question, whether you should or not is a different issue. I got my results for my master's on September 30th. How quickly will I get my Stamp 1G card? Will I get it for 2 years? Will I get a 2-year card? You won't get a 2-year card. You get a 1-year card. You should get your card in about 6-ish weeks, but it's busy at the moment. And this is the busiest time for immigration, but ultimately they're taking about 6 weeks, I think, at last check. So hopefully you will get that very shortly. And the last question I have here is, after my 2 years on a stamp 1G, what are my options if I still want to live, work in Ireland? That's the employment permit process, basically. You move into an employment permit pathway, potentially, and that's what the graduate piece is all about, moving into employment permit so that you can work towards long-term residency. Great. We have like 6 minutes. Do we want to ask a few questions if we're able to? Great. All right. Fire through it there.
So we have some roaming mics. Does anybody have a question?
There's a chap up the back there who's.
So it's not really specific only to your own personal situation. All right.
Yeah, I'll try and be as vague yet helpful if I can. Chap up at the back there as well. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Find an employer and then start like the whole process and pay everything like all by myself and then just go to the employer and ask like, I don't know, like a letter or something like that.
Yeah.
To make it easier.
Yeah, you can make it easier for them, but they do need to give you some corporate information, and they need to sign the application form. So you can do it and you can make it as easy as you can for them, but it's important that they know they have responsibilities to the Department of Enterprise and to you to make sure that they meet the needs of the employment permit. So yes, but they can't, as I said earlier, they can't not engage with the process at all because they're ultimately signing a form to the government to say they're going to hire you under those conditions.
But do you mean, can you go and without them offering you a job, can you give them it all done? Is that kind of what you meant?
Yeah, no, like you'll need an employment contract, you'll need an offer, and yeah, and it will be tied to that job. So yeah, it's very specific to that company and that job. And critical skills is for both, or for any really. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's the same. It's the same for both. Yeah, yeah. So you can do it for those as well. Yeah. Yeah, 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 you can, yeah. And the government filing fees for anything under 6 months is €500 as opposed to €1,000 for others. So it's a bit cheaper. Oh. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's not as it's can be vague with some of the critical skills roles, but most of the time those are general employment permit applications, and the labor market, that means your potential employer has to do that advertisement period of 28 days, but it can be done. It's relatively straightforward as long as the employer knows what it's doing, and then you should be able to get an employment permit that way. It's just whether the employer wants to commit to doing that. But it can be done. And there's some, very administrative roles that are on the ineligible list, but the marketing roles, not necessarily critical skills, but they're not ineligible either. So you can get some permits depending on the specifics of the job. Yeah. 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 Mm, mm, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 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 Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you're worried, I would apply now for if you're worried, but you can only apply, is it 3 or 4 months in advance. So I would apply early if you're worried. Okay, that's generally what I would regard any immigration piece. And then the other question about self-sponsorship, you can only self-sponsor if you have a job that's a job offer, and even at that, your employer, like the question from the lady in the front, that job offer needs to come from an employer who has to be happy to sign off on everything. So the pathways are reduced, but in 2 years a lot can change, so you never know. There might be more. If you really want to stay in Ireland, I'd focus on trying to get employed as soon as you can, and work your way towards that and see what happens. That might be useful. My friend up the back here has a question, I think. Yeah, 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 yeah. As long as it's over 64, you can get a critical skills. You have to meet the 2-year contract, and it has to be not on the ineligible list. But yeah, then you can get a critical skills, even if it's not on the critical skills list. Yeah. Yeah, no, so it has to be 2 years on the permit. If that was, I couldn't quite hear it, but I think it has to be 2 years on the permit. Your stamp 1G time doesn't count towards stamp 4. Sorry, yeah, you can transfer your permit if you do that transfer permit after 9 months on a critical skills. That will combine for your stamp 4. But if you said stamp 1G, your time spent on the stamp 1G won't help towards the 2 years for the stamp 4, if that makes sense. Does it? Yeah.
I don't know if we've any more time.
Yeah, we're probably tight, are we? It depends on the company. Yeah, it depends on the company. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a more of an employment law question, whether they should or they shouldn't. But the ultimately, it just depends on company policy for what they prefer to see. I think being honest is probably the best way to do it. But yeah. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you.
So sorry, there's another class in here at 1 o'clock, and I know Colin has a meeting, but I want to say thank you very, very much to Colin. I will send you the slides, and I will send you the list of companies that take employment permits, who have a history of taking employment permits, and I'll send you the list of critical skills. Yeah. Thank you.
Good engagement. I don't mind. I'll go out here just because people are coming in. If that's okay. Yeah, okay, you want it? Who's best? I like that. I'll be on the point. Yeah, that's right. Right. I'm going to stand outside.